Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lisa Gonzalez, and I am the Director of Loss Control at Insurance Board. We are here today with Christy Schiller, who is the Vice President of Account Services at Presidium, our partner in sexual abuse prevention. We wish we could actually be with you in person, but COVID had other plans for us, apparently. We're pleased, however, that we could bring this presentation to you virtually for the General Assembly of PCUSA. I'd like to take the opportunity now to introduce Christy and have her tell us a little bit more about Presidium.
Thank you, Lisa. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all today and to share some information about keeping your ministry safe. Presidium has worked with the full range of organizations that serve children, youth, and vulnerable adults for over 30 years now. And our goal really is to help you implement best practices to create a safe environment for everyone. So thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be with you, Christy, and we truly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to speak with us today. I was wondering if we could start off with having you chat with us a little bit more about some of the statistics that exist surrounding abuse, because I know they're staggering and very concerning, and I think it would be beneficial for our churches to learn more about some of those stats.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. It is important just to give everyone a sense of the scope of the problem. Research consistently shows that 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 7 boys experience abuse before the age of 18. And those numbers are staggering. And obviously, we want to change that. The good news is we have some information now that makes it easier to prevent abuse in organizations in particular. But we've probably heard those numbers before, 1 in 4, 1 in 7, and it's real easy just to kind of let those go in one ear and out the other. But when you think about the number of youths that are served in a given congregation, that those are real people. And so it's important to just keep that front of mind. There are other statistics that show 10% of school children experience abuse at school. And one that we don't talk about as much is that 40 to 50% of molestations are actually perpetrated by juveniles. And those numbers have held steady for quite a long time. And that's often surprising to folks, because I think when we sort of imagine someone who would abuse a child in our mind, we think of an adult, right? We think of a bad person. But we know that there are dynamics that produce those sorts of numbers. So it's really important to keep that in mind as well.
Christy, can we talk a little more about youth to youth abuse so people understand the distinction on how that differs from adult to youth? And I know there's a difference between what may be considered sexual curiosity between youth and then actual sexual abuse.
Yeah, sure. The dynamics are a little different. We know that children don't typically groom each other like we might see an adult do in one of those situations. It's a lot more opportunistic, and it's really just a matter of, is there an opportunity to be alone and go undetected? We see incidents of even very small children in bathrooms or other areas that are harder to monitor. It's tempting to write things like that off to normal sexual curiosity or age appropriate behaviors. But most of us that work with youth are not experts on that. And it's actually still complicated even for the experts. So we really encourage that, those situations get interrupted. And many of those actually even need to be reported, just like a situation of an adult to child abuse would be.
Christy, can you tell us a little bit more about how churches can avoid creating an environment that makes it easier for youth to youth abuse to occur?
Sure. So again, most of these incidents occur when there is a lack of supervision. And so it's sometimes hard to wrap our head around that when we think about kids running all over the place at church, because it's just like home to them, which is a beautiful thing. But that's when actually more risk can be created. So depending on the activity or the lack of monitoring and really just the lack of planning, it's really important to have a game plan. And you can still do all the fun activities, but how can you really supervise with intention? So, for example, you want to have a plan that adults supervise in such a way that it's not just, well, we have a ratio and we have two adults at everything. Well, what are those adults doing? Is it just that they are there? Or how are we really being intentional about each adult's role? Is one person watching a particular group of youths or a particular area of the facility or the camp or whatever that context is? Really being intentional about how you supervise, just like a lifeguard would at a pool, is how you prevent this type of abuse.
Right, right. I know many churches have very active youth programs and they really love to plan fun activities. Having worked out of a church that served disadvantaged youth for many years, as well as helping start a crisis center for children that served children from birth through 12, I'm very familiar with a lot of the different activities that occur. So there are some specific activities though where churches need to pay extra attention and make sure there's enough supervision provided, correct? So I think it would be beneficial if we could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we actually run a helpline at Presidium where clients that subscribe to that service call in and kind of have us talk them through situations that come up that are just complicated. And very often those calls are related to youth situations. And we actually track statistics on where these sorts of incidents are occurring. So we actually have some nice data to show where the risks really are higher. So really, anytime you have an overnight activity, uh, boundaries tend to get a little sloppier, and supervision tends to get a little more lax. But adults get sleepy and they're not quite as focused as perhaps we need them to be. So overnight activities, bathrooms, showers. I don't know if any churches have locker rooms, but pretty consistently, this is where we see, because there's that opportunity for privacy and being one-on-one. But even things like a stairwell or unlocked rooms, classrooms that aren't being used. If you have your Sunday school in one class, but there are other places that are open and kids are free to roam, that just creates more risk. So really having a good plan about where the kid's supposed to be, how are we supervising them, and how do we know that people are following those expectations?
That just brought something to mind that I thought would also be beneficial for us to discuss. And if you could give some recommendation on this, typically when you're in these church environments, like you had mentioned, it's very much like a family, right? So um, there's many times where an older child may say, "Oh, don't worry, I'll run him to the bathroom or I'll take him to the classroom." Could you speak a little about that and the importance of not giving that opportunity to take place?
Absolutely. And there are so many ways that youths can help out with children's ministries. I know at my church, they need all of the kids they can to help with the younger kids in particular. But again, given those dynamics that we know about, 40 to 50% of cases happen with an older child and a younger child. Number one, we don't want to put anyone at risk, but we also want to make sure that youths that are helping out really don't have to carry all of that. It's a lot of responsibility to supervise children, and we want to make sure that they're set up for success. So I think one of my first recommendations would be, don't let youth supervise a group of kids alone, even if it's a very mature youth, a teenager. That's really not fair to them to give them that kind of responsibility. And so just make sure that they're not counted in your ratios. They're there to help the adults, not to be the supervisors, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Thanks for sharing that with us. And I know if an allegation of abuse does occur, there is a tremendous impact on a church. So, can you tell us a little bit more about how significantly churches can truly be affected by an incident occurring?
Sure. So we monitor on an ongoing basis the outcome of legal cases and that find for the plaintiff. And when we look at those cases, particularly for churches, we just see, the financial impact. And of course, that shouldn't drive why we do all that we do to protect our kids, but it's a very real aspect. And so, very large verdicts. Um, it inhibits your ability to focus on your ministries. It really can grind everything to a halt. We also know it can jeopardize insurability. We see membership decline. Sadly, that reputational damage that can occur is really hard to get back. And some denominations know this very well. No one wants to be part of the church where that happened. To just put it out there like that. But it really is a threat to the overall mission. There have been studies, enterprise risk studies, that look at, what are the biggest risks that organizations face. And one is loss of membership, and number two is consistently an incident of sexual abuse.
Yeah, I know when I ran an outreach program for disadvantaged youth, there were so many wonderful people from the congregation who volunteered and contributed to our program in so many different ways. It's hard for most people to imagine that anyone could be capable of harming a child, let alone the thought of youth engaging in any activities that could potentially harm one another. Can I
Mhm.
think we should talk a little bit about how churches can be more vulnerable.
Sure. Yeah, and ironically, some of the things that make churches so wonderful is are those things that can make them more vulnerable. With the close relationships, and a trusting environment, and a place where we don't judge. Those are all beautiful things, but unfortunately, that it makes it harder for us to hold each other accountable in that sense. Just for example, churches historically haven't really screened volunteers and employees like other serving organizations. We all know each other, and I've been here for 30 years. What do you mean I need to do this? That's a big culture shift. Um, and again, as we talked about before, really intentional supervision hasn't always been part of the mindset of how we do youth ministry. That's a big shift. And at church, there are so many folks that are being served that may be vulnerable for different reasons, whether it be because they're a very young or very old, or people who are just struggling with things in their life and coming for spiritual direction, and even beyond sort of what happens in the pew, going out into the community. Churches serve more vulnerable populations that way too. So we also see some power differentials, and we don't really like to talk about that a lot at church, but knowing that some people in church really have power and influence that can be leveraged and used to exploit, unfortunately. So but these aren't insurmountable things, but just things to just be able to name and be aware of.
Now, I know that Presidium created a safety equation for organizations in order to create a safe environment for youth. And
Mhm.
I think it's fantastic. It gives very clear directives on what we need to do in order to make sure that we are protecting our most vulnerable congregants. So I think it would be beneficial for us to chat a little bit about the safety equation and share that information with everyone.
Sure. Well, when we think about the dynamics of sexual abuse and prevention, I mean, we're talking about a complex aspect of human behavior, and that's not something that you can flip a switch and everybody just does these couple of things and we'll be fine. It's a lot more complex than that. But in our research at Presidium, over the last 30 years, we were really founded to help organizations have a framework for how to approach this complex risk. Um, Everything ranging from policies, screening and selection, training, how staff and volunteers and youths are monitored and supervised, how you're providing information to the people you serve about not only keeping themselves safe, but what the expectations are. We'll really approach this operationally. And so this framework, and you can learn more on our website about that, but really the goal is to provide organizations best practices in the areas where we know risk is more likely to creep in. So, we're always happy to share more information, and we're going to talk more in a bit about resources that are available to help you fill any gaps to create the safest environment possible.
I think the other important aspect to just mention is that it sounds like that being able to manage these risks takes a sustainable, comprehensive approach that integrates everyone, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's never just one person's job. It's really all of our jobs. And we can have trainings and make sure we're screening and checking all of these boxes. But unless it really becomes part of the culture of our church, it's not going to be a sustainable change. And it takes some effort, but there's a lot of resources there along the way to help.
So, Christy, what are the 5 things that churches can do to help prevent sexual abuse and harassment?
Yeah. Well, Lisa, one of the first things a church can do is establish policies. And it may not feel natural to really get into policy what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in terms of how we interact with each other in ministry. But having those in policy are going to make it really simple for everyone to follow those guidelines and hold each other accountable. Things like electronic communications. We know that there's a lot of risk out there associated with that and forming inappropriate relationships. Having solid policies is going to help make sure that people know what they can and can't do, and it's going to help people know that if they see it, they need to say something. Um, Policies also help create institutional memory. So you may have some really strong folks in leadership right now who are doing a great job with all of this, but people come and go. And so if we have this in policy, we know these good practices are going to be more consistent. Good policies also communicate the importance of abuse prevention and really assures people in your congregation that the church takes it seriously and doesn't want to have a situation where folks aren't safe.
I've spoken with a number of churches about developing their policies to prevent sexual abuse, and I've had various conversations where churches make policies that they aren't really able to necessarily follow. For an example, I've spoken to people that have spent an entire summer working on their policies for abuse prevention and making sure they're doing recommended check ins, for example, throughout the night if they happen to be having an overnight activity. And then they'll mention, you know, but we can't really do that because people are really tired. So we don't really do check ins. Can you talk to us a little bit about why it's so important to make sure that people create policies that they are actually able to follow?
Yeah. I talk to a lot of organizations that struggle trying to find that balance. You want to have best practices, but you also don't want to set yourself up for failure if you don't have the proper resources in place to follow those policies. And that's not to say lower your standards, because I think that's the temptation. And sometimes there are legal folks whispering that in our ear, but it really just points to the need to put more resources toward being able to follow those policies. And what's really nice about working with the insurance board is a lot of those resources are available. So in some sense, there aren't a lot of good excuses anymore for not being able to follow best practices.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, Christy. I appreciate it. I know policies are only as good as they are actually followed. So essentially, you're setting internal standards that need to be implemented, and folks need to be held accountable when they drift from them, correct?
Absolutely. And this is the other part that may feel a little unnatural at church. We're going to talk in a bit about responding when we see red flags and concerns. So we'll get to it more there. But at the end of the day, if we're not following these policies and doing the fraternal thing, um, and holding each other accountable, we're really not creating a safe environment.
Okay, so can you speak to us a little bit more about what an appropriate screening process would look like?
Sure. This is an area that's really evolved over the years. I think a lot of organizations feel like, well, we're doing a low cost background check, so we're checking that box and we're good to go. But what we know is to really understand the risk that an individual presents, if given the opportunity to work with youth, is very much behavioral. So absolutely, we have to know that person's criminal history if they have one. But what we really want to do is try to create a behavioral profile. And I'm not saying we need to do a battery of psychological tests, but we know that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And so we really strongly encourage churches to do those interviews and do those references, because that's actually where you're going to get a lot of that good qualitative information. And if you ask those questions in the right way, you're going to get some great information about how that person may behave in the course of their ministry.
You know, I'm so glad you brought that up, Christy, because I've had countless calls where people just aren't sure what to do because, for example, they have congregants who have served in a role for many, many years, right?
Yeah.
In a volunteer position, and they just refuse to have a background check now that they might have this policy in place. Sometimes they'll say
Mhm.
things like, they don't want to give their social security number, or they become offended because they've been with the church for so long, they just can't
Yeah.
fathom that now the church is actually requiring them to have standards and submit to a background check. So, do you think
Yeah.
that churches should still require a background check for, say, someone who may have been with the church for 30 years?
I've been doing this work for 15 years, and the trend that I've seen is we got a lot of that 15 years ago. Not so much in 2020. This has just become industry standard, and particularly, folks who are parents, they're also doing this if they're going to volunteer at school. They're doing this if they're going to volunteer in their child's sports league. It's pretty normal now, and I think there's a lot of fear out there that may be unrealistic, that folks are going to react in such a way. But at the end of the day, it's really indefensible to tell someone who's experienced abuse, no, we didn't screen this person because they've been here a long time. It also doesn't sound very well in court. So it's one of those things that you just have to do it. And sometimes it takes leadership coming in and reminding everybody why we do this. It's for everyone's safety.
Right. I know that resistance is not uncommon, but probably not as frequent as many may fear it would be. And it
Mhm.
is standard protocol for any organization that serves children and youth. I know I learned a lot about screening questions during interviews, etc., as well as the importance of conducting reference checks when I was going through the Guardian training through Presidium. There have been churches who inquire about why we recommend having these reference checks. And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Sometimes three references can really feel like a lot, particularly if you're the person who's trying to chase down folks whose name and email address is given, or however that's brought to you. But I really feel strongly, for those reasons I described earlier, that this is where you're actually going to get a lot of payoff. As important as background checks are, and the spiel that I just gave about why you have to do them, we know at the end of the day there are limitations to them. Um, One, it works under the assumption that someone has been not just arrested, but convicted. And there are a lot of legal reasons why things don't get reported up through the criminal courts. So really getting this good qualitative information about an individual and asking those behaviorally based questions is going to help give you a much better profile of this person and whether or not they have the requisite maturity and skills that they need to work safely with youth.
Yeah, and I know that we have all of those resources available through Insurance Board. Should anyone need, all they need to do is come to our website and reach out, and we're more than happy to share that information and partner with Presidium to answer any additional questions that anyone may have. So we are the resources are there for everyone, correct?
Absolutely. It's there. And, again, we're happy to work with the insurance board to provide those because it's not always a natural conversation to ask someone the types of questions that we need to ask. But it's so critical. I just wanted to give a tickle for the board. So I'm curious if any of our attendees have struggled with some of these screening areas that we're talking about. If so, please feel free to share.
Yeah, because we're here to answer your questions and we'd be more than happy to do so. And even if anyone wants to have an offline conversation, I think it's important to remember that we do have a helpline that's specific for PCUSA that they're able to call anytime. Correct, Christy?
That's right. We have partnered specifically with PCUSA through the insurance board with this helpline, and all of that information is available on the PCUSA website as well.
Fantastic. So can you tell us a little bit more about recommended trainings that will help people recognize and respond to the warning signs of sexual abuse?
Absolutely. Training is one of those things that people tend to dread, and that's understandable because, training isn't always fun. And particularly when we're talking about a topic that can be painful, frankly. But, we really want to encourage that this training be more about what people can do. I think we're much more aware as a society about abuse and the effects of abuse than we were certainly 10, 20 years ago. But there are a lot of things that individuals can do in their role to make a difference. And so giving them that right content, speaking to them in their role is really going to make an impact. So not just what to do if you suspect abuse, but what are the things you can do to truly prevent abuse? And so obviously it's important for that training to be practical and easy to use, easy to access, and something that's going to be available more than just once. Training is another area that it's easy to just kind of check the box and say, oh, we did that training, we're good to go. Maybe for a little bit, but we know just the way adults learn and the way adults forget, it's easy to kind of drift from what you've learned. We put that book down and move on to the next thing. So regular communication, and it doesn't even have to be, let's sit down for 3 hours once a year. It can be those ongoing conversations that happen in your team meetings, in your ministry leadership meetings, to remind folks of, hey, let's not forget we have an event coming up and we're going to have a lot of youths here. So what are our roles and how are we going to make sure that the youth are supervised properly? It's just keeping that whole concept animated. All of that is training.
Now that we've talked about training, I think we should segue over to speak a little bit about supervision.
Yes. This is where it all comes together. You can have beautiful policies, you can have a very robust screening program, and you can have, a very nice training system. But unless, folks are following all of those things, it's kind of a waste of time. So this is where the rubber meets the road, and we're actually monitoring and supervising those ministries in the process of them happening. And so it's really important now to be mindful of all the things that have been learned, to be mindful of those policies and live and breathe them. So really adhering to them and having a monitoring plan. How are we going to supervise the youths in this particular program? Or how are we going to make sure that this area of the church that's not in use isn't being accessed. Again, it's all about that intentionality.
Why are some areas problematic?
I mentioned earlier about youth to youth, and that some areas are just harder to supervise. Um, some opportunities make it just easier for inappropriate behaviors between adults and youths or between youths to occur. So it's really important for churches to think about what are our high risk situations? What sorts of ministries and activities do we have that are harder to supervise? And how are we going to kind of fill that gap? So let's develop a system for monitoring. I mean, literally writing up a plan and developing a method to document that you're following that. It sounds like a lot of paperwork, but goodness, if there is an incident, heaven forbid, you're going to be really grateful that you have that. And that's just another way to show that you're doing what you say you're doing in your policies.
Absolutely. And Christy, one of the most important recommendations I recall from my guardian training with Presidium, and of course there really are so many, but is to establish the bandwidth of acceptable behavior. I heard you mention it earlier. I
Yeah.
think that applies in some of the examples you've given as to why this is so important, correct?
Exactly. Again, churches are very welcoming environments, and I would never advocate it being anything other than that. But we all have to agree on what's appropriate and what's not appropriate so that we can hold each other accountable. Or even as parents who have youths in a program, I need to know if there is a rule that my youth minister isn't supposed to be contacting my child via text. I need to know how my child is going to be supervised at camp or at day camp. These are things that we need to educate parents on, and really everyone on, so we know what that bandwidth is, and we can say something when we see someone step outside of that.
I completely agree with you, Christy, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. So, who in the church should be involved in implementing systems for reporting and responding?
Yeah, well, it's really everyone's responsibility to say something if they see something, and that can be really hard um, in the church context for all those reasons we've discussed. But we really owe it to each other to be honest and help prevent anyone from being in a situation, A, that may be risky, or B, that questions their intent. Right? We don't want anyone to be in a situation that's really hard to defend. And so by providing training and having solid policies, we're doing that, but also by giving that feedback. And we know a lot of folks can get kind of hung around the axle if they see something. It's real easy to talk yourself out of it.
Yeah, this can be very hard, especially in a church context, but we owe it to each other to be honest and help prevent anyone from being in a situation that questions their intent. So, can you
Mhm.
tell us how churches can create a culture that encourages everyone to buy into the philosophy of creating a safe environment and responding appropriately?
Yeah, and this is something that takes a lot of work, and it's not just a one training that's going to fix this. This happens in every organization, and it's not even limited to abuse prevention. We know that it can be a question of loyalty to the organization or to the church, that I don't want to cause a scandal. I don't think we see that barrier as much as we used to, but it's certainly something that's been very real. Um, Unfortunately, we see often that there's a question of credibility of the person who's making the accusation. And, we are learning more and more about why folks wait to come forward. We're learning more and more about, what it takes to come forward. And so we really need to reframe that thinking that regardless of this person's credibility, we have to move forward with this. Something I say a lot in trainings is uh, the victim isn't always as good as we need them to be, and the perpetrator isn't always as bad as we need them to be. These are complex humans, and so we have to just go with the information and move forward. Um, Sometimes there's, the protection of the alleged perpetrator, right? It could be a high profile person In so many of these cases, it's a shock. Uh, no one would have ever suspected something like this from that person. But we know that can be part of the grooming process. And we know that good people can do bad things. So, we've got to remove those barriers. Sometimes just the lack of training is a barrier. If people aren't seeing those early warning signs and naming those early warning signs, those situations can domino and go from bad to worse. And unfortunately, we'd be having more of a conversation about abuse than boundary violations or things that are going to be easier to interrupt. Um, Sometimes it's just too painful to think that this could actually be true, or there's guilt that this incident occurred. I think part of the scariest barriers I've seen, though, are things like maybe I've reported something before and nobody did anything about it then. Those
Mhm.
really speak to major cultural issues that need to be addressed. But even something as simple as having more opportunities for one on one meetings, you'd be amazed what you can learn when you simply ask someone, hey, is there anything going on that you have concerns about? Soliciting that feedback sometimes produces more results than waiting for it to come to you.
So, Christy, can you expand just a little bit upon the terminology grooming that you used? I don't want to assume that everyone just knows what that means.
Sure. No, that's a really good question. So, grooming is something that happens when typically an adult will invest time and energy and resources into gaining the trust of a child. So, it might be a very intentional series of, learning what kind of touch you can get away with this child. So, sort of physical boundary violations. It may be emotional boundary violations. So, seeing if you can get this child to share about their personal life, their struggles. It could also be behavioral. So, getting a child to do some things that they know could get them in trouble, like smoking or exposing them to pornography or getting them to keep secrets from their parents. And the word grooming actually suggests an intentionality, but I want to be careful with that, because we know a lot of these incidents of abuse between adults and youth. Um, it's really not that intentional. What we see a lot, and I can say this is what we see a lot in churches, is we have someone, an adult, who is getting sloppy with their boundaries, and maybe identifies more with the youth that they serve than their own adult peers. So it's not really someone who's kind of wants to be a volunteer because they have a plan to groom and abuse a child. That happens, but it's a lot more rare. More likely, we have a situation where someone is just without proper training, without being corrected when boundaries start to get sloppy. It falls into an abusive relationship, and so it's a very different dynamic. But I think at the end of the day, what's important to know is, regardless of someone's intent, whether or not they're a groomer or a predator, or it's one of these more opportunistic situations, they give off those red flags. They give off those warning signs, and those are the opportunities to interrupt and correct that path. To either let a predator know that this isn't going to work here, or give a reality check to someone who's going down a very bad path.
Absolutely. And I know this all leads us to promoting a culture of safety, correct?
Yes. And, again, we've got all these best practices that we talk about, and they're important, and these are things that you need to do. But you really have to dovetail that with promoting a culture of safety. That's going to make a more lasting impact than checking boxes to do screening and training and those sort of compliance type activities. When you have a culture of safety, standards are clear. Everyone understands what those expectations are. Standards are also enforced. And everyone knows that safety is part of their job. You can't really punt this over to someone because it's hard. We all have a role in creating a safe environment. We're all part of the environment. In a culture of safety, everyone takes those warning signs seriously. We spent some time talking about those barriers to reporting, and when you can move through those barriers and get folks to worry less about, um, if I say something, am I calling this person a bad person, or am I condemning them for the rest of their life? No, we're trying to correct a behavior, and all feedback is important because people may not realize they're the third person who's had a concern about a behavior they've seen from an adult or even a youth. Another thing we point to in a culture of safety is that morale is high, and people are happy with how things are going, and they feel supported in these efforts. When morale is not high, it can be really toxic and introduce all sorts of risks, this just being one of them. And the other thing that I would point to in a culture of safety is that the quality is institutionalized. So this kind of echoes the importance of policies, but we've got these good practices in a way that we can carry them forward and continue to create a safe environment, and that all of these initiatives remain animated. One of the biggest risks we see, frankly, is organizations who have all this great stuff, but they've drifted away from it because we've taken care of safe environments and so or safe church initiatives. So now we're going to move on to the next thing. But we know it has to stay animated. It has to stay institutionalized in front of mind. So these are not easy things, but things to always aspire to.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I truly appreciate it. Can you leave us with some recommendations of questions that churches should be asking themselves?
Sure. Yeah, I'll point to a couple. One, do you have written policies that clearly define boundaries with youth and other adults? So what have you got? Does your screening process really assess for abuse risk or even harassment? So what are the steps that you're taking? Um, Not just like an employment screening, but what are the questions that you're asking to really understand this person's fitness for working with vulnerable people? That's a little different from jobs where they're not. Um, do you require all clergy, staff, and volunteers to complete training? And is it preventive, not just reactive? Um, Another question, do you have specific procedures for managing high risk activities related to abuse and harassment? So have you kind of done your homework? Have you thought about where abuse might be more likely to occur, and how are you going to address that? And do you have some written procedures for responding to those suspicious behaviors or red flag behaviors that don't raise to the level of abuse, but maybe an opportunity to course correct for someone who's forming an unhealthy relationship, or let someone know very clearly that that sort of thing isn't going to happen on our watch. So those are some high level things, but there are so many resources available through the insurance board to help you on your way on each of these.
Christy, thanks so much for taking the opportunity to be with us today. I think the information you've provided is extremely useful and will be very helpful for all of our churches. Speaking of useful, I also wanted to mention the resources that you brought up, because at Insurance Board, we have a vast amount of resources available to all of our churches through our Safe Conduct Workbench. And this is a very exciting time because we've recently just created a landing page with Presidium through our partnership that people can access straight from Insurance Board's website, and taking them right over to Presidium and give them direct access that will be much more user-friendly and easier to access everything that they may need to conduct training.
Right. We're really excited about it too, because, it's our mission at Presidium to get as many folks trained as possible to help all along the way with screening and all those other needs, because having these available, I hope your member denominations realize what a gift this is. So, for example, one of the things that you can now access through that portal is the Armis Learn to Protect system. So that's basically our online training platform. Some of our participants may be familiar with that. So, but for those of you who aren't, it's a catalog of courses that are available to churches. And what we do as part of that onboarding process is a little bit of a screening tool where we say, check the boxes here for the different types of ministries that you have. Do you have volunteers? And we just try to calibrate to get you the right courses that are going to make the most impact for you. We also have a full background screening service available through Presidium. And for those of you who are actually policyholders, insurance board helps subsidize those, which is just phenomenal. And those are really easy to get enrolled in and start doing from that landing page. Another tool that some of you might not be as familiar with is called Know Your Score. And this is an online self-assessment where you go in and you register, and basically you walk through all of the best practices from our safety equation and get prompted for example, do you have this policy? But it's more than that. Do you have this policy? Do people know this policy? And really helping you understand the extent to which things like that have actually been implemented. So we really try to give you a good mirror to hold up to yourself to say, how is our congregation doing? And that's free as well.
Speaking of Know Your Score, I think it's important to mention that when you referenced allowing churches to have a mirror held up to themselves, that they should know that that mirror is really only for them. That this is a tool for them to be able to self-reflect and give them a chance to recognize where they really could improve in order to create this culture of safety so that they are able to protect their most vulnerable congregants, correct? So, and on that note, one of the things that I am truly very excited about is a new resource that we are now offering to all insurance board participants called CASE, which is a train the trainer program that I am very excited to roll out and have Christy tell you a little more about.
Thanks, Lisa. This project is really close to my heart, so I appreciate any opportunity to talk about it. So CASE is an acronym for Creating a Safe Environment. And this is, just as Lisa said, a train the trainer program. It's intended to be presented live. And what it really does is it gives volunteers and employees the information they need to keep themselves and the people that they serve safe. And this is particularly geared toward serving children and youth, I'll say that. But it's really an opportunity to get the most updated, researched program out there. We spend a lot of time talking about youth to youth abuse. I mentioned earlier that a lot of folks aren't getting that training. And so that was one of our big goals for that program, is to talk about that. We also talk a lot about the adult to youth dynamics and red flag behaviors. We spend a lot of time on breaking down those barriers from reporting. We did a lot of research and learned so much about where that system can break down, because that's consistently where we see the ball get dropped. And then we also talk some about mandated reporting and the importance of listening and getting that information to the folks who need it. What's really cool about this program, though, is not only is it the good information that I just described, but it's presented in a very unique way. We actually hired a film producer to help us tell the story of what we might call a typical youth serving organization. So a lot of training is kind of theoretical. If you see this, do this. If you see this, say that. But we kind of give you a universe to put all of that into context for you. And we've gotten some great feedback because there are 4 kind of episodes built into the program. People want more. So it's kind of like Netflix. You're really excited to see the countdown that the next episode is starting. And who knew that abuse prevention training could actually be that entertaining? So we're really excited about it, and we think it's going to make a huge impact for a lot of organizations.
You know, Christy, just to add to your comments, as someone who has worked in and among youth for almost 30 years in many different capacities, I was extremely impressed with this program because it does a fabulous job of identifying situations that may be occurring right under our noses that we aren't even thinking about because that's not something that enters our minds, but it kind of allows us to take a moment and pause so that when we're moving forward and we might encounter a particular situation where we may raise our eyebrows, to stop for a moment and reflect and take it seriously. And I think this brings some things to light that it is important for us to recognize and have valuable conversations with one another and start the conversation.
For sure, and that was really our goal. When we beta tested this video, we heard people talking about it in the parking lot after, which was really cool because I think it did uh, really open some eyes about things that can happen in the chaos of doing youth ministry, and you start to suspect in the video that some it's going to go one direction, but you learn it actually goes a completely different direction because it's easy to overlook things.
Thank you so much, Christy, for taking the time again to be with us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're going to remain on the line here to answer any questions that you may have in our chat function. So please feel free to do that. Obviously, we understand that the content of this discussion may be more confidential, so you may feel free to reach out on our 1-800 line through Presidium to ask any questions that you may have, or feel free to reach out to myself at Insurance Board or Presidium directly. Remember that we are here for you and we have plenty of resources to offer to help keep your congregation safe and protect your most vulnerable congregants. Thanks so much, everyone, and we wish you a wonderful afternoon.